For years, DC has been told that outdated, tough-on-crime ideas are the only way forward. But what residents want and need is investment in real, effective solutions. Programs like community violence intervention, housing-first approaches, trauma-informed care, and mentorship programs are helping break the cycle of violence today. It's time to invest in what actually works. If we're going to talk about public safety in DC, let's talk about what we know really makes us safe. Go to realsafetydc.org to learn more.
Today on CityCast DC, Trump's deployment of the National Guard and ICE had some very obvious targets. But in the background, homeless folks were also feeling the pain. There were displacements and arrests of homeless encampments, all in the name of keeping the city clean and crime-free. Franziska and Madi Koesler from Street Sense Media break down what happened over that month and where DC's homeless population is at now. Today is Wednesday, October 15th. I'm senior producer Julia Karen, and here's what DC is talking about. Franzi, Madi, welcome.
Thanks so much for having us.
Glad to be here.
All right, so you both tag-teamed this really extensive piece for Slate that covered 6 people who were affected by Trump's use of force to clear homeless encampments in Washington, D.C. Can you elaborate on some of those people's stories that you covered?
Yeah, this is Franzi. And so the piece opens up with the story of a woman named Megan Abraham, who is from Southern Maryland, but has lived in D.C. for past couple of months, past couple of years. What happens to her is kind of sort of like the flashpoint when the takeover starts. So she's been living for the past couple of months in a tent on Long Washington Circle, kind of like if you're driving down Pennsylvania and you're going to like hop onto the circle there. She lives in like one of those like little concrete islands where if you would have been able to see tents there in the past, there are no longer any tents there. And so on 3 days after Trump announces the takeover on August 11th, she and her boyfriend are in their tent at around like 7:30 p.m.-ish. FBI agents show up to her tent. I was there and the FBI shows up and they sort of tell her like, hey, you have to move. Abraham is then able to produce this like notice that the city has given her. So the Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services, DMHHS, you're going to hear us say that a lot. They're like the big agency that covers encampments in DC. They're the city agency that covers encampments. So they do all sorts of clearings run by the city. They have a dedicated encampments team. And so they had given Abraham a notice to get cleared that following Monday. But the FBI shows up and they're kind of like, you've got to go. Abraham gives him this notice. And then suddenly the agents are like, we watched this all happen. Suddenly the agents sort of appear like someone confused. There's a little bit of confusion. They're not sure really what to do with this sticker that the city has given them. They kind of leave. They come back once again that evening. But by the end of that night, around midnight is when we checked back in with Abraham. Her tent was still standing. Everything was still fine. Or so she thought. Until the next morning, she's on the phone with her father, who'd actually seen her name in the Washington Post. She's talking to her dad and then the Metropolitan Police, which, as I'm sure like all DCers will remember, was under federal control for a while during those first couple weeks of the law enforcement surge. MPD shows up along with like one orange trash truck from the Department of Public Works. And they basically tell her, you have to go right now. And this is the next morning at around like 11:30-ish. And they tell her you got to go. And she then has to pretty much pack up her entire life. Her boyfriend's at work at the time. She loses a bunch of her stuff. All of her neighbors' tents are trashed. And then MPD goes and visits a bunch of other sites throughout the city and also does the same thing, pretty like indiscriminately throwing people's stuff away, not really waiting to see if people have time to come back, time to collect it, anything like that. And so that is sort of the first big set of clearings. And then more clearings follow, although that is sort of one of the only ones that's like pretty like significantly conducted by law enforcement and not by DMHHS. And since then, a lot of these people have scattered. Like Megan now lives in a really remote corner of DC, like really, really far in the woods. Like you would not be able to see her tent from the road. But Other folks have moved across the border to Virginia. Still other people have just decided like, hey, I'm going to throw my tent away. Like if I put up a tent, it's going to get taken. So there's been a lot of sort of scattering. And I think Madi can speak to this a little bit better than I can because she was actually there when the city did about 3 weeks after the takeover started, the city did a census of people living outside. And if you want to go, Madi, and sort of explain what they found there.
Yeah, so this is Madi. So again, they conducted this census that they were calling it. It's really similar to what they do in January of every year, which is called the pit count, the point in time count, except they weren't surveying individual people. Essentially, what outreach groups and DVH and DHS were doing were walking around the city on foot. Basically, every alley, every street of DC, they walked from the hours of, I believe it was around 7 or 8 p.m. until around 1 a.m. that night. These survey teams went out and counted people that they were assuming to be sleeping outside. And the issue with that is because they weren't surveying people, the numbers, they weren't 100% sure how accurate they were going to be. But what they found out is based on like outreach data that the local outreach teams have and this January count that they did, that really homelessness hasn't decreased in DC. If anything, people are just living in tents much less, and there's a lot more people sleeping unsheltered on the sidewalk and alleys in the woods.
Yeah. So basically what this count found was that since the beginning of the takeover, the number of tents in DC has decreased basically by about 50%. There used to be something like 107 tents. Then they found there were like 54 in this count. The number of people sleeping outside, however, was almost equal to what it was in January when they did the pit count.
So basically, like the visual representation that we think of when we think of homelessness, houselessness, the tents, sleeping bags, whatever you might think of, that obviously is gone, but the people are still there.
Yes.
You had mentioned that obviously these people got pushed out and had to leave stuff behind. What were some of these folks able to keep and what did they have to leave behind?
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of what people were able to keep, that really sort of depended from person to person. It depended how much notice they got. So some of the other folks we talked to in the Slate story, one of them, Jesse Wall, his tent was one of those tents that Donald Trump posted to Truth Social, being like, all of the homeless in DC have to move out immediately. And so his encampment was actually cleared by the city on August 14th, so before the FBI showed up at Abraham's tent. And it was done by DMHHS, by that city agency. And so he and others in that encampment had a little bit more time to pack. So Jesse still has a lot of his important documents. He still has all of his housing voucher documentation. And he was really able to like hang on to a lot of important stuff. He did have to pretty significantly consolidate down, though, his things in order to like stay mobile. Jesse's now in Virginia. And so one of the things that he gave up, and like he made this as a pretty calculated decision, knowing that he wanted to be able to like be more mobile and be able to quickly change spaces if he needed to, is that he gave up all of his pillows. Megan, on the other hand, like pretty significantly, she lost a lot of her clothes.
Yeah, so you mentioned that these folks moved to Virginia mostly. I imagine that some people have moved to Maryland because of this if they live maybe further north. Have those governments, Maryland's government or Virginia's government, done anything to help or hinder the folks that are coming in and out because of the takeover?
So we've been sort of, following up with folks in human services in Montgomery County and with folks in Alexandria and Arlington as well. And we're also like sort of have reached out to the Metropolitan Council of Governments, which is the sort of like, they're like sort of a, maybe like you could say like a regional council of governments, which includes the DMV area. They're also the folks that organize actually the point in time count every year. The DC point in time count was always done in conjunction with surrounding areas, with the like thought that people do actually move between them. And what actually all of those places have told us is that there hasn't been a significant increase in unsheltered homelessness outside of the city. That there has been maybe somewhat of an increase. There was definitely some preparation done in those places, and like very close monitoring, but they actually have not found that numbers reflect any kind of like really significant statistical fluctuation. So that is also like something to note, is that yes, 2 of the people featured in the piece chose to go to Virginia, but on the whole, it does seem as though a lot of people have sort of stayed in DC, have just given up their tents. There also have been some people who have chosen to move into shelter in DC, although not a particularly high number of people. Again, that is a number that is very hard to track. It is hard to track if people going to shelter are newly experiencing homelessness or if they are people who are living outside and are now choosing to come into shelter. That can be data that is very hard to keep track of for sure.
Mark the date. This November 8th in DC, join the National Center for Victims of Crime for its 40th anniversary gala. It's an evening of celebration and sparkle, with dinner and a silent auction filled with one-of-a-kind treasures. Raise a glass with friends, honor champions of hope, and help make sure life-changing support for crime survivors remains accessible. Join NCVC for an unforgettable night of connection and purpose, all while supporting services that make a real difference in your community. Go to victimsofcrime.org/40 today to grab your tickets and join us for this unforgettable night. That's victimsofcrime.org/40.
Hi, I'm Michael Ziviak, Chief Revenue Officer of CityCast. Why do most of us want to learn a new language? It's because we want to speak it out in the real world with real people. Babbel gets you there fast. My daughter's a senior in high school, and after she graduates, we're taking a father-daughter trip to Spain. I know, she's spoiled, but that's on me. I'll be honest, my Spanish right now is pretty much tops out at ¿Dónde está la biblioteca? But when we get there, I want to actually talk to people, order food, and really connect with the locals, not just stumble through the basics. That's why I'm starting with Babbel. Learning a language with Babbel is all about small steps, big wins, and progress you can actually track and feel. And with how busy things get here at CityCast, I love that Babbel's bite-sized, 10-minute lessons fit perfectly into my day, whether it's between meetings or while I'm having coffee in the morning. I'm really excited to start picking up real-world Spanish before our trip so we can experience Spain in a more meaningful way. Right now, Babbel has a special deal for our listeners. Get up to 55% off your subscription at babbel.com/citycast. That's BABBEL.com/citycast for up to 55% off. Rules and restrictions may apply. Gracias and adios.
So obviously, the takeover of MPD by President Trump is now officially over. But how much has MPD been coordinating with the mayor's office on some of these clearings during both, with the Trump administration at that time and now in the present moment?
Well, if you went to encampment clearings before all of this started, it wouldn't be uncommon for them to be a cop or two on site.
There are like specific MPD officers who are sort of, I don't exactly know what their titles are off the top of my head, but they're trained to do sort of a very specific role when it comes to dealing with people who are unhoused and like are given extra training and that kind of thing. And folks whose like job it is to also sort of specifically to do like law enforcement work around that. But yeah, it is pretty common to have MPD at encampment clearings pre and post takeover. So the agencies that are present at a typical city encampment clearing are that Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services that I mentioned earlier, MPD, the Department of Public Works, because they're the folks that do all of the actual like picking stuff up, throwing stuff up away. Oftentimes also there's like other kinds of cleaning that happens afterwards. So there'll be like rat abatement or there'll be like power washing if it's a sidewalk and there's stuff on the sidewalk.
Yeah, and that's also done by a contracted biohazard engineer as well, who's separate from the city.
Got it. So this is like the mayor is contracting out with those people to do this stuff?
Occasionally, yes. I mean, it's always DPW, DMHHS, MPD, and then the Department of Behavioral Health is usually also there, and the Department of Human Services is also usually there. The city does offer people storage when they do encampment clearings. They offer people sort of 2 bags of storage. There are some limits on what people can store. They can't store like food, stuff like that. So there are sort of things that can't be stored. Oftentimes also people don't opt for storage because they either don't trust DHS or they just don't want their stuff stored. They want it on them. There's many different reasons why people will opt not to store their things. Where Maddie and I have primarily seen MPD play a role is when the Department of Behavioral Health, it's usually they who initiate this process, initiate something called an FD12, which is sort of placing someone on an involuntary psychiatric hold. And that can happen for a bunch of different reasons. Sometimes it happens because like DBH sort of determines that that person is a danger to themselves or others. So there are cases like that. And then there are cases where people sort of just don't want to move their stuff.
Do you know if Mayor Bowser has said anything on record, or have you contacted her about those clearings with MPD?
They typically do schedule encampment clearings in DC. They schedule encampment clearings out, let's say, usually around a week or 2 weeks in advance. It used to be that they had to schedule them 2 weeks in advance. The DMHHS is an agency that does try and give people notice, that does try and work with residents as much as they can. When it comes to those encampment clearings that MPD carried out when the takeover happened, that sort of where Megan Abraham lost some stuff and where other people lost a bunch of stuff, that is something that we have asked the mayor's office about. So we asked the deputy mayor for Health and Human Services about that incident. And in a statement to us, they said that they were not aware of those clearings and that the district had scheduled an engagement to close that site at Washington Circle on August 18th. So that was 3 days after it was actually closed by MPD. However, today, federal officials chose to execute the closure at the site and several others. And so beyond that sort of statement, like, we don't really have that much else. It's still a big question that Madi and I have is who exactly was 4 days into Trump signing the executive order. It was also, I believe, that morning there was the lawsuit filed by AG Schwab regarding the services versus control of MPD. So there are a lot of questions about also who exactly was making all of the decisions around this. But Madi and I do know that it was just MPD officers and DPW. There was no federal law enforcement presence there when those encampment clearings actually happened.
Also to note is that Deputy Mayor Wayne Turnage at the census that they did noted that they're still figuring out that relationship with the federal side of things versus the local side of things. And when he mentioned that, they also discussed that at the end of the day, they want DC to have the final say.
I think it's also worth pointing out that the District of Columbia has had a pretty strict, no camping policy for years now. It has engaged in encampment clearings for years. And I think that this is something that we sort of touch on in the Slate piece, but the attention and the increased sort of national discourse around encampment clearings that came with the Trump takeover made it seem as though encampment clearings were something that, were completely new and were something that were being mandated by Donald Trump, when in fact, the city has always cleared encampments. Clearing encampments isn't something new in DC. The speed at which encampments were cleared certainly did change during the takeover, and the amount of notice residents were giving and the agencies involved did shift at certain points in the takeover. But the city has very often cleared encampments. It does also, even under regular circumstances without the takeover, did also used to clear encampments with only a day's notice. It would conduct something called immediate dispositions when it proved sort of an immediate health and safety hazard to surrounding neighbors or to the park or whatever, and they would clear people with only 24 hours notice. So I think that oftentimes, or what has partly happened in a lot of also the national narratives around what happened in DC during the takeover was this is some huge deviation that has to do with the Trump administration, when in fact, the policies around clearing encampments have existed in the District of Columbia for years. We have also seen MPD detain people at encampment clearings before. In 2024, the DC police temporarily detained, and this was before Madi and I were at Street Sense, but detained a pregnant Black woman during an encampment closure in April of 2024, and then proceeded to detain her for a while and then release her again. So there have been instances of certain kinds of force being used even before any of the law enforcement stuff, in part because what it boils down to oftentimes is that sometimes people don't want to move. So I would just really want to underscore that I think that while the takeover did sort of change the certainly did change who was making some of the decisions and the speed at which decisions were being made, and the speed at which encampment clearings were happening. The city has always cleared encampments and will continue to always clear encampments because that is just like longstanding city policy and law. That being said, there were significantly more during the takeover. There have also been significantly more in the last 2 years in particular, like 2020, 24, and 2025. The numbers have gone up in terms of clearings.
Got it. So what does it actually take to move folks who are houseless into legitimate housing? Like, what needs to happen?
Well, I mean, I would say the process looks very different person to person. Certainly, there are people who, like, a housing voucher is going to be the thing that connects them to housing. There are other people that are maybe going to self-resolve. They are going to, either find employment if they're not employed, or if they are employed, save up enough money for that first month's rent security deposit situation and self-resolve. Self-resolving is a relatively uncommon thing that happens, although it does happen. There will be people that get connected to stuff like Project Reconnect, or they'll move in with a family member for a while before they can kind of get back on their feet. There are people that if they've just fallen into homelessness, they'll get connected to something like rapid rehousing, which will help them get an apartment and other kinds of assistance in order to sort of like, help them, sort of like it's easier if somebody has recently become homeless for them to become housed again. But most of the time, people living in encampments meet the definition of something called chronic homelessness, which is a definition developed by HUD. And there's there's federal guidelines, and those people typically get connected to housing vouchers or something known as permanent supportive housing. But it often takes years. The housing voucher wait list is years long in DC, like it is in many, many other places in the country. And it often takes also years to build trust. People oftentimes don't want to sign up for stuff, or they don't know that they're eligible. I think Madi and I have met so many people who don't think that they are eligible for all sorts of public benefits, including the housing voucher wait list. And so it often just takes a lot of time and a lot of patience and a lot of working with people. And there are all sorts of ways also that these systems calculate how vulnerable someone is, which places them on a higher position on the wait list. We know people who have been on the housing voucher wait list for years, for many, many years.
G mentioned in the article, he counts it by the weeks. This is week 68 of being on the housing voucher wait list.
So how would you both describe the current moment that DC is in when it comes to homelessness?
The moment that we're in right now seems to have built up over many years. A lot of advocates have been talking about encampment clearings for a long time, but that hasn't been in national news. But these clearings have been going on for a long time. The increased clearings have specifically targeted tents in a lot of cases without more services being added in some cases. While DC is a right to shelter, a right to a shelter bed jurisdiction, a lot of people have issues with DC shelter, and this is nothing new. And so a lot of advocates have said, if we don't work on these things, it makes it really difficult to get people housed or inside or in shelter. And so what's happening now just seems to be the culmination of things that have been going on for a long time, and how the increase of clearings over the past 2 years have, gone on this trajectory.
I would echo what Madi has said. I think it's a moment in which homelessness is perhaps more visible and more discussed than it's maybe ever been. While at the same time, it is down slightly. The numbers from the 2024 pit count show that I believe homelessness is down 9% in DC. That it's somewhere around 9%. I might not have that number 100% accurate right now. And you do have some sort of also newer models being tested. You have the Aston, which is a non-congregate shelter, which recently opened up last year. And then you have a similar facility opening up at E Street. For folks who don't know what non-congregate means, it is basically just a shelter where rather than people being in a bunch of bunk beds or being 12, 16, 20 people to a room. People have private rooms, usually with like one other roommate. So these kinds of shelters offer much more privacy. Think about it more like a little bit like what a college dorm room or a hotel room might look like. And people have the security of like having their own key. And so spots in those shelters are oftentimes also being offered to people for whom traditional shelter doesn't work, to couples, to people who are experiencing disabilities, and also to encampment residents, to people who have been very resistant to traditional forms of shelter. So DC is working on kinds of shelter that I think a lot of advocates and a lot of people outside would say are more attractive and like maybe a little bit more humane. And I think also there is a growing, and this is not just a DC trend, but a growing discussion of like, how affordable is it for people to live in major American cities? Like, I think that is something we're talking about. And I think that it actually feeds in pretty well to some conversations about homelessness and how we solve homelessness in a lot of these places. 47% of people in DC are rent burdened. And so I think a lot of people are starting to understand or think about, even if they are housed, what the growing cost of living means for them. And I think that is also like definitely causing people to also think a lot about, what does it mean to think about building deeply affordable housing? What is the need for that beyond people experiencing homelessness and for people who are currently renting and that kind of thing? So you have this dual moment of like things, people feeling like very economically squeezed, the increased intention, and also DC is trying a couple of new models. And we don't really know what like those are going to do. We don't really know, like the Aston has not been open that long, but certainly there are people for whom that model is very exciting, and for whom like that model seems to be working well. And then there are people for whom it is not. So you have a lot of like, I think I would say also like general willingness to try things and to really think about like how we think about this problem.
So what are you both thinking the future of homelessness and houselessness in DC is, and what are both of you kind of tracking and keeping your eye on that we as listeners should be keeping our eye on?
I think something I've been thinking a lot about is that there is, and this is also sort of addresses your previous question as well. There's been a lot of attention in the last couple of years of people who live in encampments and people who live outside. So people who are like immediately visible as homeless, right? Most people experiencing homelessness in DC live in shelter. The vast majority of them live in shelter, and the vast majority of them, and oftentimes people who live in shelter spend longer in homelessness than people who are unsheltered for a bunch of different reasons. And oftentimes they're also less well connected to services. And this is more of an anecdotal observation I want to preface. Like the data on some of this is hard to track, but like I would say that the people I know in encampments are like very connected to their case managers. I don't know if people who live in shelter who are considered like safer because they live in shelter have that same kind of connection always. I think it like very much varies from person to person. And so I would say that like that is something I've been thinking a lot about, is that so much of the discussion around homelessness is people who are immediately visible as homeless, but so many of the people experiencing homelessness are actually not visible in the same way, and probably also require different kinds of outreach and different kinds of case management, and like require and deserve just as much as attention as people living in tents.
Yeah, kind of on that same vein, I feel like what I've been thinking a lot about, especially when it comes to how people are living together in the city and how that's changing, and how you have a lot more intergenerational housing situations, and how you have a lot of people, especially like young professionals who might be, living on a couch, and that's like their apartment situation. You've got 6 people living in like a 4-bedroom house because that's what they can afford in the city. And how that kind of ties in to the social network. Like, yes, like especially in the national news moment we're in right now, unsheltered homelessness and like living in tents is being spotlit. But the housing crisis goes far beyond that. And so seeing, especially in DC, how that changes over the next few years, as it's changed for the last 2 to 5 years, and the trajectory of what's happening.
I think the other thing that I'm tracking to add is that I do think that homelessness is becoming a partisan issue in a way that it maybe wasn't in the past. I think that there is a lot of discussion right now, and you'll see it from all sorts of folks in the Democratic Party will sort of condemn Donald Trump for his comments about homelessness. We've seen Fox News commentators say some pretty violent things about people experiencing homelessness, and you'll see a lot of outcry about that. And then also people like Gavin Newsom in California are passing the exact same policies and doing the exact same thing. I think there is a sense that homelessness is becoming a partisan issue. Certainly, we saw Trump also using it both in his campaign and recently as a way to paint blue cities in a very specific way. But I would also point out that these kinds of policies, specifically around encampments, are actually something that happens in both blue and red places and are something that are in some ways actually nonpartisan because you see leaders and politicians in both parties endorsing them and carrying them out. And I think that is also something that is personally just interesting to me that I'm tracking is how the discourse is becoming partisan while at the same time you see these policies being replicated in places with all sorts of political leanings.
Yeah, I mean, encampment clearings were happening in D.C. when Joe Biden was president. He just wasn't, going on social media and talking about his daily commute.
That was Franzi and Madi from Street Sense Media. Madi and Franzi, thank you both so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Julia.
That's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoy the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. It's called Hey DC. It's fabulous. Also, become a member. It's $10 a month, $100 for the whole year. You can do that at membership.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with even more news from around the city. Bye.